Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Domingo.
And I'm your co-host, Virginia Grenier.
We'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy some inspiring conversation. Here at Language of the Soul, we know that life is story. Individually, we're the products of the stories we tell about ourselves. Culture is the amalgamation of the stories we weave about the human condition. Here's the thing. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. Thanks for tuning in and joining in the march toward human potential. Hi, guys, and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast, where life is story. Thanks for joining us today. Those of you that have been tuning in regularly know this new season, season 3, is largely about going back to my book. As much, the book that inspired the podcast. So as much as I love showcasing and highlighting kindred spirits and self-professed storytellers in the arts and entertainment, I wasn't getting my jollies really imparting my life's work, and it was nothing less than that. So we're getting back to it, and we're going chapter by chapter. We've talked about the intro with certain guests, and now we're moving on to chapter 1. So hi, Virginia, by the way.
Yes, hello. And I'm excited to finally get to, we're actually in the book now.
Woohoo! Finally, yeah. Well, what I was saying to you earlier is it's a lot of concepts from the book come up because, again, our guests tend to be like-minded and these are very universal things, but then they end up being treated a little without the nuance. And so they sound like platitudes in a way or talking points. And I just think they deserve to be talked about with nuance and done justice. Is that English? So diving in a little deeper, I think, is going to be satisfying to me and hopefully to listeners.
I agree. And I think it's going to give us an opportunity to really, because we've talked about life as story and we've, as you said, we've been more on that surface level of the concept, but now really to get into the guts, right? The meat of what we've been really trying to impart.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I have said to you also, I can't be expected to remember every study that I cite, every author of every book that I cite. But I am excited to get into specifics like the biochemical level of storytelling and the different neurotransmitters that are, the biology of storytelling. So little specifics like that we really haven't indulged yet. And without expecting me to be able to cite everything in the bibliography, I think we'll get a little more specific than the general ways in which we've addressed some of these topics.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think it's been great because before we get into these discussions, if you haven't, as a listener, tuned into the episode before, Nick reads each section before we get into the discussion. So we highly encourage you to go back if you haven't listened to that episode to really put it all together in your mind.
This is the only nonfiction book I've ever written, by the way, and it's the only one about which I've heard myself say, it's great toilet reading. Like my fiction, I want people to, read start to finish the way it was intended. This one, I would be bored. So I do feel like if you put it on the toilet, the back of, the tank, and then just read a section and hopefully it'll inspire you while doing your business. But it's the only one I think can be done in chunks. But I would say the same of those episodes, like just listen here and there if you're jogging or taking a long drive. And I wouldn't expect anyone to get all the way through the audio version of these chapters, but there might be a grain of something in there that'll inspire somebody.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, as we've had to go back, to do each episode that we have, obviously the intro that we've done, this one we're doing right now, and the ones that will follow, it's been good for us to kind of go back through and go like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that.
Right. Anyway, well, hopefully we'll hit on something that'll be of value to our listeners. But as we often say, or I do, this serves me as well. And the idea of just furthering the dialogue and the dialectic, and it's my church.
Yeah. And with that as well, we're also bringing back some of our past guests that have come on and have shared their wisdom and insight throughout seasons 1 and season 2. So that's also going to be a fun aspect, is to bring back past guests to talk about the book itself.
Yep. Yeah, we have our favorites. I've enjoyed every episode, and I regularly say we've had no duds. By the grace of God, we've had no duds. But yes, of course, people that we invited on because of a long shared history, or we just know they'll have something of value to contribute. That feels good to me. And again, it's my church, so getting back in touch with some people that actually were quite formative in my in the early 90s has been really satisfying to me. So yes, today's guest falls into that category. I couldn't adore her more. Do you want to bring her in from the green room?
Yes, so we are going to bring in Andrea Simleski. I think I just pronounced.
Slominski.
She's a PhD, so she works in women's therapeutic midlife and menopause coach. She's a speaker and an author. So, Andrea, come on in if there's a little bit more you would like to share, just to kind of remind past listeners.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. And yeah, I'm really thrilled to be back here with you and Nick both. Yeah, my background is as a theater producer and director, and then I taught theater for and produced theater in college for 10 years. And so the telling of stories and the sharing of stories is really my my background and my foundation. Then during my midlife shift at about age 50, I went back and got my master's and PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute up here in Carpinteria. So, yeah, my storytelling, the effect of storytelling, the power of storytelling, and the importance of storytelling is sort of been, I guess, what I've done most of my life. So I'm really thrilled to be here.
No, we're glad to have you. And it's funny that you mentioned that you went back, because obviously I went back, finished my master's, and have gone into mental health. And of course, my background is also being an author and working in marketing. So, which we'll get into further on as we do this season, but how propaganda works, which marketing's a part of
Mm-hmm,
that.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
it's kind of funny, like how all of our backgrounds tie into,
We're
and
like a
how.
Venn. We're a Venn diagram.
Right? Exactly. No, we really are. And with that said, too, that we've also gotten to, like, what they consider that midlife crisis time of our lives, where we've like, where do we go back and reevaluate and transition? Which, oh wait, that's another topic we'll be
Right.
talking about. So,
And that's narrative, right? We're all kind of rewriting narratives. The
yep.
thing is, Andrea, it's not like she's been busy or anything. It's when are you going to get up and do something with your life?
I don't know,
Please.
it's just I'm just stuck in that, like, my midlife discovering my personal myth and
No,
helping
you
others.
both, you guys, my hats are off to you. And Renee, by the way, to go back to school later in life and is just so impressive to me. So, but I do feel like too, Andrea, when I was going back through the chapter in preparation for today, I realized not only are you an expert in a lot of areas and you can bring so much to the table in terms of furthering the conversation, but I was really put in touch with your love of storytelling. I mean, of course, I know your background is in theater. Of course, I remember when you were considering, right, going back to school for film. And I
Mhm.
remember some really kind things you said about my films at the premiere. And I I don't know if you remember, but
Yeah.
very specific things. And I just was put back in touch with what you really are about fundamentally, and that is storytelling. So it's not a stretch at all to bring you in as an expert. I think that is do you identify as a soulful storyteller and you happen to have some
That's
expertise as icing on the cake? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think everything that I do in terms of my practice in the past 10 years is about helping women really identify their story, who they are now, where are they in their narrative right now, what's going on, and then we take the approach of looking back into their story, right? And
mm-hmm.
looking all the way back and saying, okay, let's look at all your previous chapters and let's see how you got here. And only then, once we understand how we got here, then do we look forward and saying, okay, now where do you want to go? What's your next chapter? Where do you want to write? I mean, I have a huge tattoo on my left forearm that says once upon a time, because every question that you're asking, every answer you're looking for is in your story.
Wow.
Oh, I love that.
Mhm.
Well, that gives me a perfect jumping off point to get us going.
Please.
So, all right. So, again, just remind everybody that we are going over chapter 1 of Language of the Soul. And so, just to kind of give everybody a bit of a grounding, including us here, starting the discussion, this chapter does a lot of heavy lifting. If you haven't listened to it, again, I encourage you guys to go back and listen to last week's episode. But so, from my lens, which is coming from that mental health counseling lens, the chapter for me, I feel like really mirrors what we see in psychology, as Andre just pointed out, that people don't just reauthor their lives until the story that they've been living collapses. And I feel like in
Mm.
this chapter, we see it, it seems to suggest that culture works in the same way. And so, Nick, what I noticed going back and through this chapter for today, that it's not just an introduction to what story transformation is. There's also the argument to it. It answers the question why story matters at all, especially the moments of cultural upheaval. And you open in a very specific time, which was the pandemic and the isolation and the unrest during COVID-19. And
Hmm.
you frame story not as entertainment, but as something essential to human survival. So
Hmm.
I'd love for you to kind of just touch on that original intention for this chapter.
Okay. Well, yeah, as most, well, the introduction, I think, just told readers who I am, what constitutes my worldview. I was a weird kid. I liked sea monkeys, and it kind of just gave them a snapshot of the world in which I was brought up. And that includes all the hippies at the Creative Arts Center, listening to Puff the Magic Dragon on the radio and just kind of set the tone for who I am. And then it moved through my career and the different, you know, in my teaching, I learned more than I could have in a book. And so this is all what's informing my worldview and hence this book. The top of chapter 1, I think what you're referring to is I talk about how the book came about. And it was really just, I was invited to do, I don't want to repeat the whole chapter, but I was invited to do an online course on storytelling. I'm part of a huge animation community, and CTNX is the expo that I've been a part of for 16 years. So the creator of that, Tina, had asked me to do an online course. And again, it was so needed because everybody was isolated. And I think a lot of people were rethinking their paradigms. But more importantly, artists were really experiencing catharsis through, the creative process. Everybody was on fire creatively with no outlet. So I agreed to do the course, but I thought, we don't need another opinion. I almost said, you know what opinions are like, right? Since when do I have an editing mechanism? We don't need another book about the Western storytelling arc and blah, blah, blah. So I settled on, rather than talking about the nuts and bolts of technique or craft, is how I put it, let's talk about why we tell stories in the first place. So to condense this a little bit, in the writing of it, oh my God, more and more I realized not only what I was passionate about imparting, but just how incredibly vast the role of story is. And sorry to go on and on, but I happen to have been going through, a lot of changes in my life as well. And I had to reframe a lot of my narratives. So it was almost like the writing of the book mirrored my evolution in real time. And I think those are the things I respond to. If you grow as a result of the creative process, that transcends and speaks to people. So it became more and more about the stories we tell ourselves, whether it's about that woman yanking her dog along on that we see across the street. We build a whole story around her on very little information, right? And so I just realized all day, every day, we're literally creating our own realities via the stories we tell and the lenses we wear. So it just became a little more broad and philosophical as I went along. Is that what you were asking at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it ties to, and I know Andre, you understand this as well because you touched on this a little bit when you came on, because like in narrative therapy, that's one of the things that, and I know I've talked about that before in past seasons, but it's the stories that we're born into, the stories that are told to us, the stories we tell ourselves, and then of course the stories that really happen. So that build those narratives that we function in, right? So one thing that I noticed when I was going through this and just kind of getting myself back into, okay, we're focusing on chapter 1. What exactly, was chapter 1 again? And went back through it was what stood out was that in the chapter, the idea that crisis isn't an interruption of human progress, it's actually the engine to it, is how I walked away. So you talked about how both individuals and societies only transform through conflict resolution, that we don't evolve when things are comfortable and in the familiar. It's when the old thought forms stop working. So I'm curious, for both of you to speak about why that feels so important, especially in the opening of chapter one, to start in that place, connecting storytelling directly to those moments of breakdown and the uncertainty that we do experience.
Andrea?
Okay.
I can.
I thought you were going to go first.
Well, I will gladly, of course. I do want to say, to really start at the beginning, all day, every day, we go out into the world as organisms, right? And we encounter stimuli. Together, some of those stimuli create events, right? We process or assess all events that we encounter throughout the day as threats or opportunities. It may not seem that way. It may seem like, oh, some things are just neutral, but this is all very, right, unconscious. And when an event is accompanied by heightened emotion, it gets mapped on our worldview or value system for our survival, right? And then you could extend that and say, arguably, so that epigenetics can then step in and make sure future generations, when they see a snake, right, have an innate response to the formal properties. Or when they see red, which, this in the art direction chapter becomes very real. Red can signal a lot of things, and none of them are particularly comfortable. They're all alarming. So you get the idea. There's either in the extreme a fight or flight response, or the opposite. There's an opportunity. I want to mate with that, right? Or I want to get to know that chick, whatever it is. But even on a cell biology level, there's a growth or a protection response in every case. And so maybe that's why we only transform through conflict, is that if you don't have cognitive dissonance, there's nothing to resolve. And so therefore, there's no new thought form to be created. So yes, there's a micro and a macro. I just kind of make the case that on the grand scale, as we were just talking about with the Arab Spring and this moment, frankly, if we're not challenged, we can't evolve. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And then I go on to say, and artists and storytellers are at the forefront of that, in my opinion. And we can go more into that later. Andrea.
Yeah, I had mentioned to you earlier, Nick, that this idea of that we transform through conflict resolution, I think is a really fascinating idea, because, people don't like to be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
People don't like change, right? We think we want kind of things to, if things are pretty much okay, we'd rather they continue the way they go. But like you say, if there's no stick stirring the coals, basically, the fire's not going to leap up, whether it's the creative fire or the fire of change or whatever it is that we're looking at. I just think that we see like conflict, and we also see, and we had talked about how I also see problem solving as a sub chapter of that, like in terms of the human condition, right? But looking at conflict resolution, yeah, I mean, it's part of the ultimate form of storytelling, but it's also part of the ultimate form of living. It's the two are it's almost like saying you're the fish swimming in the water and you don't see the water. You don't know you're swimming in the water. Conflict resolution leads to creative processes in order to find whatever the desired or even negotiated outcome, right? Because we don't always get exactly what we want every time we resolve a conflict, right?
Right.
Sometimes it depends on communities. Sometimes it depends on nations agreeing. Sometimes it depends on circumstances, around the conflict itself. But yeah, absolutely. It says here in the text, the seeming disparity of these back-to-back world events can be easily explained. Crisis yields opportunity. And I think that's
and
so true.
strife signals change.
Yeah, I think it's so true, not only in life, but in the creative process itself.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just
Yeah,
made
go
a
ahead.
connection, and I have to be transparent at this point to our listeners. We started chatting in the green room, and some of it was not that we're changing the world here. I hope we are, but we don't take it too seriously. But we got into some good territory, so I'm going to cut that in later. So this might be a little bit out of order, but I just figured out the answer to your earlier, I guess, question or prompt. What is, you seem to be pushing back a little bit on the idea that storytelling is the main means by which we transform. And you said, well, what about problem solving? And yes, of course, innovation is the outcome of the creative process. And I was saying, well, maybe story is just one aspect of the creative process, and they can be synonymous. But what I realized is if you look at the creative process, whether it's the Wallace model or any of the 7 accepted models, quote unquote, accepted in academia, one of them is always identifying the problem to be solved. Then you have lateral exploration or brainstorming, and then you have inspiration and all these steps. Mm-hmm. And they can be in different orders. But maybe the parallel here is that even cognitive dissonance, forget about the micro and the macro for a minute, but even in your own little noodle, if you have 2 thought forms that aren't synthesized, that's called cognitive dissonance. Even if it's subconscious, you identify that as the problem to be solved. It's the same creative process, right? And so you solve the problem by synthesizing the thought forms into a new novel one. And that's what you're doing when you partake in story. You are following that protagonist who has a goal, but you know what? Something's standing in the way of that goal, and it's called the antagonistic force. Therein lies the conflict. And you could just say the parallel is that is the problem to be solved in the creative process. So when you resolve that conflict, the outcome is the main theme. The way in which the conflict resolves is the takeaway. And so that's the new thought form or paradigm. Are you seeing the parallel? It's literally the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to me, and Virginia, this kind of overlaps into what we do is looking at holding the tension of opposites, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the conflict, right? We're holding the tension of opposites, and by holding the tension of opposites and wrestling with it, right? A third way appears, which is the transcendent function, right? Which is the transcendent function, which is the middle way, right? You're holding one side, you're holding the other, and through the tension of holding both sides and trying to resolve these oppositions, right? Then through the creative process of the tension comes the third or the new way or the resolution or the solution or what could be called the transcendent function.
Well, and I want to go into from us. I'm going to twist the angle a little bit for everybody. The other thing too, talking about conflict resolution and the transformation that comes with that. When we talk about staying in the comfortable, right, being basically complacent, right, in the familiar, and so growth not happening in there, I feel like what happens too is it stifles the curiosity, where when we're in a conflict, the curiosity comes like, well, why? We start asking those questions. Why is this happening? What does this mean? And so I think that's an important piece. And I think, Andrea, you'll agree with me. When we sit in the therapeutic space, we're constantly turning those lenses to look for those questions as we're holding those 2 opposites that are in conflict with each other, like, so we can help form or get that perspective shift. And I think that's one thing that I think as artists, storytellers do, is you guys are constantly turning that lens, like, well, what else does it mean if I turn it this way, or if I look at it through this light? And you're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about, Nick.
Yeah, I think that the whole idea of changing the perspective, or as I say to my clients, like, just put on a different pair of glasses, right?
Right.
Situation, and the idea of storytelling, which is so powerful to me, is it allows us to build what I call a mythic perspective, where we look at whatever is happening from the top down, and we see the larger arc of transformation or of the human condition, of where this conflict, where this chapter fits in the human human narrative, as opposed to sitting with the problem and feeling like we're under it, that we're being smothered by it, that we're being extinguished by it, right? To build a mythic perspective, it demands a storyteller's perspective to be able to look at it from the top down and see how it began, where it's at, where it might go, what the choices are, what are the essentials of the particular narrative that we're living through. It demands that perspective. And
is just a question, is the mythic perspective, is that synonymous with kind of a meta view or a maybe universal view or an objective view or not?
I think you could say similar to a meta view, but looking at it in terms of
meaning. I'm sorry.
tying it very at least I do. I tie it very strongly to the archetypal, the subconscious, the experiential aspect of living a life as a human being, as opposed to sort of an abstracted meta view.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
And so to me, everyone is living their own myth. Everyone is living their mythic narrative, whether they're conscious to it or not, right? And so we can look at all of the mythologies and the stories told since the beginning of time, right? And we can see them as examples of how to navigate issues and problems of living a human life, of ways of thinking about ourselves, our lives in relationship to community, in relationship to nature, in relationship to the greater cosmos. So I mean, storytelling is it from the moment we're born and we're suckling at our mother's breast. That is our first story, right? The desire, the need, and hopefully if we have a caring parental situation, right? When we cry, we're fed or we're changed or whatever. And then eventually we get enough consciousness to realize that mother and I are not the same being, that we are then actually two different beings. And then that begins really, in a sense, our story, our of self and other, and all of the relationships that come in between. So sorry, I'm getting kind of off track here, but
it's all awesome. Virginia, I'm sure you have somewhere you want to take this, but I do want to jump in. A few things you said, everything you said made me want to jump in. I get excited, but I think some concepts in the book are related to the way you just laid that out, because I offer the suggestion that, Jungian terminology doesn't always fly. People are more apt nowadays to talk about tropes that you internalize through social conditioning than archetypes that live in our cellular memory or our collective psyche or the reservoir of the collective unconscious. Some of that's uncomfortable now because of changes in academia. And I don't know what you subscribe to and what you don't, but a really empirical way to look at it might be, and it also speaks to the connection between the micro and the macro. We all live our personal narratives, as you said, and our own myths. I've long wanted to do a workshop where you tell the story of your life using whichever archetypes, bring in the unicorns, bring in the mermaids, whatever. And I've done it in a few cases in weekend workshops, but I want to keep, exploring it. But it's fascinating what comes out of people and what they tap into. It comes through them for sure. And so we can speculate till the cows come home about how we come into, or how we have access to this collective unconscious with all these archetypes living in it. I've written entire chapters on it, and there's opposing thought forms. But on a really empirical level, as I said, all organisms create growth or protection responses to the threats or opportunities they experience all day, every day. Some things get mapped, and epigenetics is really learning about the mechanics by which this happens. And without getting too woo-woo about cellular memory or anything, or consciousness, we are the only organism that not only can augment what's in our DNA through life experience, and that does become encoded in the ways that I gently offered earlier, that we're also the only organism that can vicariously learn and grow, right? Our brains don't know the difference between the suggestion we're being burned by an iron in hypnosis and actually being burned by an iron. In the same way, when you engage in a story or indulge a story in a theater or by reading a book, your brain does not know the difference between actual life experience and the suggestion of it. So we are transformed when we hang in there and get the redemption or the resolution of the conflict. So I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe some of these archetypes are ingrained through the act of vicarious suggestion. We're the only, think about that, the only organism that can listen to gossip and internalize an expectation.
Yeah, and I love where you just took that, Nick, because that actually leads to where I was going to direct us next, which is moving on to what I felt was the heart of the chapter, which is the question why we tell stories in the first place. And so I was kind of listening to what you're talking about, and even what you put in the chapter, you lay out the core human motivations, passing of knowledge, entertainment, exploring nature, imparting wisdom. And, within that, of course, are those archetypes. And going back to the whole epigenetics part of it too, I mean, as we progress and we digest story and go through our lens that we see life through, I mean, that's how we highlight certain markers within our DNA strand. And so what really struck out to me though is you're not just treating this as like a separate function. It's basically an expression of the same instinct within all of us. And you also talked about in the chapter too about being born storytellers. And to me, it feels less metaphorical, but can be kind of literal to a degree too. And so what I mean by that is, so like what resonated with me is the idea that story isn't something we just learn to do. It's something that we remember how to do. We're born into stories. Like I said, we're shaped by stories, and eventually we're asked to decide which ones are going to keep us going. So I would just really love to see how you guys tie that into what we've already been discussing.
I guess I'm always going first. Is that it? you said so much there, but I think it sounds a little bit like logotherapy, right? We retain the narratives or we reframe the past. We did that whole episode about what are the 5 words that characterize the 50s. What about the 60s? So we do it culturally and we do it for time periods. Which narratives serve us the best in moving forward? Which narratives, right, contribute to our growth, and everything else falls away. So I don't know if that's related. Yay or nay?
Yeah, no, it is. And with that, it's also, you can go into that whole one of the famous quotes from Viktor Frankl is, when the situation can no longer change, then we are forced to look to ourselves for the change. And so I think that ties into that whole how do narrative serve us, and when do we, as storytellers, go back and do that editing, go back into that introspective, which is what I feel like happens when we're in that conflict resolution, right? We are forced to look internally like, well, I can't change the situation I'm in, so where does the change need to happen?
Andrea, I have so much. I always have something to say. Trust me.
I'm taking the journey of your thought forms, and I'm like, I'm with you. I think that this, for me, this always comes back to the idea, and it's the age-old academic argument of which came first, myth or ritual, right? And without getting into that dialectic, from there, that developing then into religion, right? At some point. And so storytelling, I think initially, if we can imagine, because we can't know, if we can imagine, early Neolithic man, around the fire and telling the stories of survival, of where they found the game or where they didn't find the game, or where the bear lives and what to stay away from and whatever, that kind of thing, certainly initially for survival, for community survival. But then as we move forward, like through human history, we look at it, just brings to mind for me the whole reason for storytelling, the reason for personal narrative, the whole Campbell's four functions of myth, right? And so that the fourth being, how to live a life, right? How do you live a life in your culture? How do you move from being an infant through childhood to adolescence to becoming independent, maturing, moving through your life, making sense of your life, and then heading on out the door, right? And so story is the literal and literary and metaphoric guide, right? Of living. I mean, I look at the example you give of the Lion King, and talk about a story about how to live one's life. I mean,
yeah, I say in the book, arguably, story teaches us how to live in the world. And then I'm the weirdo who will go on to say, most people talk about the human condition and it's got to be a relatable, right, protagonist with a conflict that speaks to the human condition. And the level I always experience the stories that affect me on are, what does it say about literally the expression of consciousness in the physical realm? Like, I go to the metaphysical. It doesn't just speak to the human condition, but what does it say about, whether you're an amoeba or a human, the nature of consciousness in the physical realm? But I don't expect anyone to come along for that one. But a few times, I'm going to take this opportunity to use a few times when you were speaking, and Virginia, I wanted to jump in and say, you're talking exactly about why the book is called Language of the Soul. Because pre-language, the reason we're wired for metaphor is the way I'd put it. And I think you hinted at this too, that we have an innate understanding of the fact that parable, metaphor, myth, folktale, we're wired for it. I kind of make a case in the book that pre-language, we dreamt in images. We didn't have the conceptual interim of language, which is arguably ineffective at communicating the ineffable anyway, right? The truth, the ultimate truth.
Yeah.
So we dreamt in images. And that could be argued in one of the reasons, things speak to us profoundly despite language, and it could account for the archetypes in general.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I was just listening to synchronistically, I was listening to an old Joseph Campbell lecture just recently, and he was talking about dream and dreams being the image and the images and symbols created by the different organ systems in our body in conflict with each other and what their needs are, right? And that then image and symbol then come out in terms of dream being the tools, the paint, the paint brushes, the tools that psyche uses to actually create story, right? All those images, metaphors, symbols that relate to the deep collective unconscious. And so from that place is why, in a sense, we all relate to story. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, that's kind of what I was hinting at. That's why we're wired for it fundamentally. But I also, you're prompting another story. I have a long history of somehow being surrounded by staunch empiricists who just think I'm a whack job. And so I had one roommate who would just conveniently, and I tell this story in the book, leave out, the latest issue of Popular Science or you name it. But they were always very empirical. And, I remember the God Gene article way back in the 90s. And I remember another article he left displayed on the kitchen table about how dreams are literally just the random firing of neurons. It's the cleaning of the pipes. It's a necessary function of the brain. And my reaction was, well, why can't it be both? Why can't it literally be just taking the events of the day or the year or a lifetime and juxtaposing them in a way that conveys meaning? But, that's not wacky. It could just be what you need to do next for your survival. It could be very survival based. So I don't know why we throw out the baby with the bathwater. Why can't we be wired for a very important neurological function while we sleep, but also attribute meaning to it? Because it's not random. I think it can be both. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
exactly. And I think you and I are both adherents to the both and way of
right.
to the both
Right.
and way of thinking, because to me, a lot of the empiricist ideas about consciousness and the things that we're talking about collective unconscious, myth, archetypes, those sorts of things, the idea that there's no ghost in the machine, that it's a machine,
it's so it's so in vogue, isn't it?
yeah, it's a machine all the way down. It's a
Right, right.
all the way down to the most minute chemical bonding or breaking, and that it can all be explained in that sense. And to me, there are so many aspects of the human experience, and you can just throw a few out there, like a synchronicity, right? The dreams that are precognition, right? People who have visitations or dreams or experiences of others who have passed on, or the experience of things like I don't know, anything that you could think of in terms of what would be considered the metaphysical experience. I think physics is coming back around.
Right? Oh, it's so catching up.
It's coming back around to the idea that everything happens in and emits from a unified field of consciousness.
Right, right. Yeah. It's too much for us to grasp, though. That's the thing. People are more comfortable just poo-pooing ideas they're not comfortable with. But when you have cell biology, quantum mechanics, and pretty much every field of science agreeing that we move through this field and we reify the information, and as observers, if you know about the observer effect, like that's the only definition of reality that even can be remotely quantified. So I think science has already caught up. It's just too much to grasp. Even I can step into that space and begin to grasp it with a lot of missing information. But the bottom line is, I'm pointing out we're wired to understand the metaphysical nature of the universe. So I go a little bit into conceptual interims. Like we are wired for language, period. You cannot convey a concept without having a subject and a predicate. That's every language, even if the form and the structure and the syntax is different. So in the same way, I just make the case in the book that we're wired for metaphor. So again, quick example. I foolishly chose to learn French as an adult, and I blame that on the Burbank Unified School District. I somehow graduated without ever having taken a language. But at Disney, as an adult, it was right down the hall. I could learn French, and I just thought being a writer, I might be inclined toward language. So in French, of course, you have no masculine and feminine concept. And being a gay man, I never really understood gender to begin with. So the best advice my teacher gave me is like, you got it. It's not going to be memorization, because purse is feminine and penis, other way around. Penis is feminine and purse is masculine. So I'm like, okay, it's going to be memorization. And she said, maybe when you think la table, just picture long, sensuous legs of a woman, and there you go. And that is the key. When we learn vocabulary, it's not just utilizing the word in a sentence, it's utilizing the word in a sentence that means something to you, something that's going on that day. And so anyway, I go on and on about literally perceptual interims, image associations, and they're crucial to learning and memorization. So then I say, hence the literary metaphor that makes story the most effective teacher of all. So when you started talking about problem solving, I'm like, well, I can't disagree. But then I realized, oh, it's the same creative process. But I will dig my heels in on the fact that we do change minds by touching hearts. When you are didactic or try to use persuasion, people dig in their heels, fall back on cherry picking and identity politics and confirmation bias and all these ego-driven things. The thing is, if you use the chemicals that we go into a little bit later, the chemicals, and it can be very calculated, and for the almighty dollar, as you were hinting at, Virginia, for advertising, for all kinds of less than respectable outcomes. But if you're using it to transform people for the betterment of our march toward human potential, I'm on board. But I guess the point is, if you understand the mechanics by which you can shift paradigms by opening hearts and it's chemical, yes, then I think
absolutely.
that's what we're wired for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I completely embrace the science behind, how story that touches the heart, right? That opens the emotional gateways, right? Is transformative. And it's a powerful way that we, like you said, that we reach into teaching people new ways to perceive the other, new ways to perceive ourselves, to break down barriers. And I think for me, it's both. And for me, there's also the deep work of the psyche, the deep work of of dream work, of the field of consciousness, of archetypes that have obviously been created by our experiences through, you could call it the soul epigenetics, right? Of experience that concretize these particular ideas into archetypal fields or whatever. But I just don't prescribe to the machine all the way down, because I think that's missing a key aspect of what it means to be human, right?
Yeah, people that say consciousness arises in the brain, right? If the ghost in the machine thing, it just doesn't even jive with quantum mechanics or cell biology in any way.
I mean, if humans were the only ones to have consciousness, maybe that might be arguable.
Well,
yeah. So go ahead.
I was going to jump in here to kind of go on the empirical side, and not because I'm pushing back and using, but to show that empirically they are noticing this. So another way to think about it is story and how implicit memory are companions. And what I mean by that is that they walk together and have been walking together through our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex long before we started, especially like in the medical field, right, with looking at, the empirical side of like, what does it mean of the conscious, right? And so if you think about it, implicit memory is what we use that helps us remember like what happened on Tuesday. And it's those story patterns, the sensations, that emotional weather that we feel within our body, that somatic experience that helps us remember how it felt to be small, unsafe, desired, rejected, smooth, and unseen. We don't just recall, right, our memories through just like very logical fact. It's usually a sensational feeling, like when we hear a song on the radio that brings us back. It goes back to that whole episode we did on nostalgia, Nick. That really shifts us, right? And or the voice we hear, it awakens our desires, and it helps our body decide before our mind even takes that vote on what is and isn't. And so I think sometimes when we get into that empirical argument of, where does story really play, and does it have where we can break it down into that, scientific method, I think that's where we forget, like, there is this, maybe it's not the conscious of like awareness, but it's in that subconscious and below the subconscious where it really works and does the thing in the primal brain that is always below that conscious level surface.
Yeah, I think it's your background in improv, Andrea, the yes and always adding. I don't think any of this is mutually exclusive, and frankly, it stimulates me to look at the empirical evidence supporting what we often call intuition or instinct. And I love these conversations, but I would say what you just described, you could also almost equate our sophisticated limbic system with sentience. And it evolved. In the book, I do go a little bit into how, in terms of entanglement and interconnectivity, how single-celled organisms, long before they became tissues or organs or organisms, still formed villages. And non-locally, they would communicate chemical threats in the environment to one another for a growth response. I love that idea. We were already depending on one another as single-celled organisms. And does that make a little bit of sense? So this, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
So stuff like that excites me because I'm so into our interconnectivity. And But I just think I do slowly make a case for what you're hinting at, which is A, they're not mutually exclusive. I kind of lost my train of thought, but how we're wired to perceive the metaphysical nature of existence for our survival, yes, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with projecting the meaning onto it in the ways that, Viktor Frankl and logotherapy would say is synonymous with being human.
Yeah, well, and that goes into where I'm going to take us next, which is the authentic voice and purpose, right? So there's that moment in the chapter where you start to talk about voice, and not as a stylistic or a technique, but as a way that something emerges when an artist connects to their true craft and actually, drives them to contribute, right? And you say that once that voice is honored, it naturally connects to purpose and then to contribution. So to me, that feels really important because for the audience, that's learning about this book, I feel like we're speaking to them every week that we put out an episode on that level.
I kind of forgot. I know there's a whole chapter devoted to voice. I kind of forgot that I bring that up. It's got to be toward the very end where I issue that call to action. Is it toward the end where I talk about voice?
It is, but you do touch on it in chapter one about,
Yeah,
that authenticity of voice, and it's not finding meaning, it's making meaning and therefore defining what the purpose is into our contribution.
yeah. I mean, I could preach, and I guess I have been, but I think the call to action near the end of chapter one was I do go way more into style and voice later. But I think you would agree, almost every one of our guests has, we didn't plan it, but it just kind of happened. They're kindred spirits in a good way, but they all say, oh, yeah, I had that come to Jesus moment or that brush with death that put purpose on the front burner. And I finally took my really well developed, mature voice and separate milestone, applied it to a sense of purpose. So I will say, in an empirical sense, we are wired to grow and to propagate and proliferate. Yeah, we die eventually. Maybe once we no longer have something to contribute to the tribe or to the collective, once we've done our work. But I do think for the most part, we have homeostasis. We have all these built in things that mean we're actually meant to realize our potential as organisms and then contribute it back. And that's how it kind of works collectively. We're wired, I don't know if it sounds cheesy, but to be our best selves, because that's what we pass on epigenetically to our offspring. So that's the call to action for me is like, maybe some people will never figure out why they've chosen a given craft. Why am I playing the violin or why am I experiencing my personal catharsis? They'll never be in touch with what it contributes on the macro level to the collective. But some people do. And sometimes it takes that brush with death to really, open your eyes to what it is contributing on the macro level. Mm-hmm. But I would say my call to action is, you can just have a craft and you can be a cog in an enormous machine or an in-betweener on production and animation and just put a roof over heads and put food on the table. And that's beautiful. Your life is about, the village in another way. But a lot of people, especially when their kids are out of the house and they experience empty nest syndrome, are called, to re-embrace their gifts and figure out what they now have to. And you can probably speak to that, Andrea, in the Regency stage.
Yeah,
aren't a lot of women rediscovering what's my purpose now?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think going back to and Jung was a man of his time. He's not perfect. A lot of great things have come out since his work, right? That founded on some of his work and ideas and concepts. But saying that midlife, whether for a man or a woman, is the time of life where we, turn away from the field of accomplishment and mm-hmm. inward to the field of meaning, purpose, and belonging. And so I think there comes a time when you've, and this is what I talk about in the Regency life stage for women in the householder years, women are, doing a million things and keeping everything running, and biology and culture encourage her to do so. And so then when the biology shifts with the perimenopause, menopause shift, and then midlife comes along at the same time, right? then we get a lot of women who are saying, okay, who am I now? What do I want to do? How can I live my most authentic and fulfilled life? Right. And that is in essence kind of what you're talking about in the sense at the end of chapter 1, where you say, the evolution of consciousness is the more prescient conversation when it comes to potential, right? And it's the awakening, in a sense. If you just want to take this as one example, it's not the only time, but if you want to take the midlife awakening for men or for women, right, where we say, okay, what now? Who am I now? Not sure where I am or if this is where I wanted to be or what's happening, but what's next, right? I love what you write here. Intelligence is creativity in motion. All change comes from imagination and visualization. Creation is the very manifestation of concept as percept. Therefore, if we can imagine it, we can create it, right? Finding your voice and your unique contribution to our collective evolution is a process that can't be rushed. And I find so by 2030, there will be over 87 million women in the US over 45, right?
Oh, wow.
And that's a new milestone, or?
Yeah, well, it's, the women who are aging into this transitory period that I call Regency from 45 to 70. I mean, starting with boomer women, we're the first women in the history of humanity to live past menopause as a cohort. Now, individual women have always lived past menopause, and I've talked to you about this before, since the time of Plato, but having entire generations of women, I mean, in 1900, statistically, most women were dead in the US by 51.
Wow.
So we've got, another 20 to 30 years.
But it's almost, we talk about getting your hands in the clay on this podcast almost every week, right? Get your hands in the clay and we can tell our own story. Isn't it an exciting thing that we get to now write this chapter?
It's a gift. It's an amazing gift. I mean, all of the women in my matriarchal line going back thousands of years are standing behind me cheering, saying, go, go, go. I mean, I'm living into a life stage that they never had the opportunity to experience,
I love that.
So
you're doing good work.
Well,
because we are creating, and again, in this mess that we're in.
Yeah.
We all feel helpless. What can I do policy-wise? Nothing, really. But if we all communed like we're doing now and brought thought forms, maybe new novel thought forms that have never been synthesized before, that is the movement. And we are creating a future. So that includes, Regency. It's a new phenomenon. I just think ideological shift is where it's at. And social reform only comes from ideological shift. On again, the small scale, maybe you have one charismatic individual and they form a movement and then other people get on board and it becomes a critical mass. That is as important as anything you could do, writing a letter to your congressperson.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're sort of in this, it's interesting. We're in this shift period where, we have women, living longer, men living longer, everyone at midlife reassessing what's happening and trying to think about what do we want to do? What is the potential? What is our legacy? And contributing to the fact that something new is coming. And
I hope so.
each person living their authenticity to the best of their ability in their circumstances, because not everyone is living in the same circumstances, right?
Yeah,
is going to work towards moving us to some sort of conflict resolution, and that doesn't mean that it's not going to, that the conflict itself may not be difficult and heartrending and
uncomfortable at best.
Uncomfortable, yeah.
In the book, I quote Gandhi, of course. You just go straight to the source. Why not? I quote a lot of people, Maya Angelou, people you just can't argue with.
Yeah.
But be the change you wish to see in the world. Yeah. I was saying that during the pandemic, during that moment where I think we were all being called upon to look inward, right? Because you couldn't really go out. But I think a lot of people missed the opportunity. And somewhere in there, I won't throw any under the bus, but I said, we all need to maybe just do some inner work and then be the oh my God, be the change you wish to see in the world. And I was told that's pretty Pollyanna. And I thought, okay, but that's the only way, actually. It's the only way.
Well, and
It's the only way we're going to get out of this mess is if everybody does their work and then there's a shift on the macro scale. Sorry, I'm preaching. Go ahead.
No, and I agree with you. And I think that goes, it was just making me think about the theory that I've been working on, the concept of a theory, but how it's, looking at ourself individually, right? And understanding who we are on the individual scale, but then how we apply it to the system. And it goes back to what you were just saying, Andrea, about, these women that we have like a whole cohort of women who are, in that past the perimeni and menopausal phase of life, and moving into not just a few but like a bigger group of women into this older wisdom age era. And if you think about it, that ties right back to our storytelling, right? Because it's that wisdom, it's that audio storytelling, even if it's just through the generations. I think back that I'm really lucky that I have women in my family that typically until late have always lived to be in their 90s to 110 years old. And when I say of late, meaning my mom, because she died in her 70s, and her mother, who died in her 80s, which is very out of the norm. But I have a picture when I was born, and it was maternal line, mother to daughter, 6 generations in the photo, which is so
Wow.
rare. Which is so rare. I mean, I'm like an infant baby. This isn't 75, so I don't remember.
Yeah, but that's awesome.
But it's amazing. But the fact that we have more of that now, so we have where you have direct, which goes back to the stories that did happen. So direct storytelling of people who live those experiences still around to share that story so we can learn from it. So now it's the stories that we're being told, right, for us, but they're also the stories that did happen. And then from there, the story that we tell ourselves based off what we're, from all of that, I think helps us find our authentic voice, helps us find our purpose, and therefore helps us understand who we are individually, and then how we fit into that collective, right, into that system, and gives us that purpose and helps us assign that meaning. Where before, I think because people died so early on that they tried to impart that, but you didn't have it so generationally that we do now.
Yeah, I think I that's a huge part of the gift of, but and at the same time it's simultaneously a challenge, because in this culture, old women are reviled or tolerated at best. And so
I was
as
going
we
to, sorry, go ahead.
as we age out of, our fecundity, our fertility, our sexual attractiveness, our culture, our heavily patriarchal culture, right, rejects that sort of older woman, which is interesting because it sort of allows us to evolve into our authentic space, leaving sort of the world of the male gaze behind, but it also sort of isolates us in terms of the different aspects of what it means culturally to age. But one of the things I wanted to say that both of you had sort of jogged in my mind is that looking at like storytelling and talking about conflict resolution and looking at the long, from the mythic perspective, right, from the top down, this whole shift from about 1900, with the birth of what we'd call modern psychology around that time, with the birth of the women's movement, which is through suffrage, the suffrage movement, all the way up till now, we have this, along with the rise of consciousness, the understanding of, let's just say, looking at it from the storytelling perspective, the understanding of the physiology of storytelling, the understanding of the psychology of storytelling. But we also have the return of these ideas directly, the return of the feminine, the sacred feminine, the goddess, directly in culture as movements, but subconsciously also in the aging of entire generations of women into, like you said, Virginia, into this new wisdom, this new. We always had the crone age, but now the crone age is like post Regency, right? And so this rise and return of the feminine, to me, speaks of a conflict resolution to patriarchy.
Yeah, it's like an identity crisis.
That there's,
if we all have masculine and feminine
Yeah.
in us, it's an identity crisis.
right,
Yeah.
but that there's a looming possibility. Let's put it that way. There's a looming possibility of the balancing of the feminine and the masculine, if we want to talk about it in archetypal terms, not necessarily gendered expressions of those, right?
Right.
Because I think we're evolving beyond that, which I think is thrilling. So that when we're talking about ultimately conflict resolution in the story that we're living right now, with what we were saying before we started, of the last swipe of the cornered animal, that is patriarchy baring its teeth, sharpening its claws. This potential in the return of the feminine and the rise of the feminine since 1900. I mean, if you do any of the reading, of the early psychology up through, I don't know, you get to Marion Woodman and Carol Christ and all the matriarchs of feminism and archetypal feminine understanding. I think there's a huge potential to rewrite this story. No, not rewrite the story, but write the next chapter.
I was going to say, yeah, that's really beautiful. And that is the question we need to be asking always. What story should we be telling? What story do we need to tell next in this march toward human potential? So that's really beautiful. And we're coming up on an hour and a half. So I want to include what we said in the green room because I think it was some good stuff. But I just, total transparency, I'm going to tack that on the end as just, I don't know, an extra feature. It'll be our extra. So I'm going to tack that on the end. But in the interest of coming to a close, I love what you said. And I do think that's the story we're telling, is the ushering out of unsustainable things we've outgrown, like patriarchy and all that stems from it. So that is the new story that we need to be telling. And yeah, when you talk about people digging in their heels or the cornered animal, it's like it couldn't have been clearer that we just weren't ready to elect a female president.
Yep.
But anyway, I do want to bring it to a close, Virginia, but I think that we could do a whole episode, and we kind of have, on what we're talking about here. There's a reason that, and I just wanted to say this too, like, I think returning wisdom as a cultural value is behind embracing our crones. Instead of taking women out to the field and shooting them at a certain age because they can't produce children, like, we just as a culture need to be less youth oriented across the board and start seeing our senior citizens as relevant with a hell of a lot of wisdom. There's no cultural value on wisdom, the wisdom from experience at this moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's no seeing it as a resource.
Right.
Yeah, at least in the global north. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where I would put my focus. Not being a woman, I would just say, let's put some value back on what we all have to offer to the village, and I'm going to mix metaphors, as one thread in the tapestry.
Yeah, I was going to say, it goes right to one of the things that you say a lot in a lot of our episodes and even in the book, which is that story doesn't hand us meaning. It creates the conditions where meaning can emerge.
I like that. Thanks for tying it back to story in general. Okay, how do you see this coming to a close?
Okay, well, so
there's plenty in chapter 1 we didn't get to, and maybe that's what we'll talk about next week. Are you joining Renee and us?
Yes, I would
Andrea?
love to. It would be awesome.
Yeah, I would love to get into the chemical, literally break down the chemical outcomes when you partake in story, whether it's around the campfire, right? Or a Shakespearean template, or a Greek tragedy, or the latest, greatest effects-driven franchise, what?
Community catharsis through story.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
there's we go chemical by chemical.
Yeah.
So in the same way we talked about, why do we tell stories? Well, to impart wisdom, right? To leave a mark. All those, there are lists we could go to, and maybe
Yes.
that's next week.
That is. We will be diving into that into the next episode. That will be wrapping up all of chapter 1, and not saying that we haven't covered a lot, because we have. But just really quickly, I just want to zoom us back out. So chapter 1 doesn't just teach us how to tell stories. What we basically have, I feel, come across is that it's established why story is inseparable from being human, and that and I also feel like your chapter 1 really frames how storytelling is meaning making as transformation and cultural evolution.
It's the title of the chapter.
Yeah, which is really and so going back to what you said, so next conversation we are gonna dive deeper into those mechanics. So we are gonna get into the chemistry, the structure, the responsibility that storytelling has, what that outcome of its power can be.
Yeah, the angel's cocktail and the devil's cocktail.
Yeah, I love those.
Yes.
Next week.
So
next week.
That'll be next week. So I would love for either one of you or both of you to just share one last and party message, and we'll wrap it up from there. Till next time.
Why do I always have to go first, Andrea?
Oh, I'll go first if you want to.
I'm stumped. Yeah, give me a minute to think.
One of the things that I always felt was fascinating about storytelling and creativity historically, or at least this is my theory or my idea, I guess, is that when there's conflict that needs to be resolved culturally, like when we see big, huge shifts throughout human history, what I've seen to be true is that the resolution or the shift of consciousness into the next stage or into the next development always comes through the arts.
Yes, thank you.
Through the arts. And it starts with the individual artist. It starts with the writer who works alone. It starts with the painter who works alone. It starts with the sculptor who works alone. It starts with the composer who works alone. And somehow the zeitgeist, the birth of the new idea or the pushing into the new concept or style or consciousness or way of thinking starts there. And from there, it goes to more of the collective art forms. From there, it goes into theater, right? Where it takes more than one person to create the art, right? Or it goes into symphony or opera or whatever. And then once these collective art forms grab onto what the solo artist has started, then more people in culture become exposed to these art forms by the very nature of the performance, right? Or not everyone could read, or not everyone could, could get to a concert or whatever. And so when you get to these larger cultural shared experiences, then those shift the consciousness and drag everyone with them over the precipice into the new.
Beautiful. Wow. Well, and also the very first, if you believe the cave painting with all the hands was one of the earlier ones, it was communal from the get-go.
Yeah.
So anyway, I love what you said. I'm just going to do a quick soundbite, I guess, as my sign off, but I also didn't expect my brain to go this direction. It's kind of the nature of the moment. I guess I feel like it's easy to be discouraged, for me anyway, when I watch too much news. I just don't want to get out of bed, let alone give a shit about the future. Or, I don't have children, so I don't care. I'm sorry, Virginia, I've said this. Like, I don't really care about leaving a better planet to my children. I do think this is worth sustaining: democracy, humanity. So on a good day, if I've listened to enough Jane Fonda, I can contribute, and this really helps. I have to get some wind in my sails to even do something like this, because I feel pretty futile and pretty lost. So I know everybody can fall victim to despair. But maybe if we all start to see this as an exciting moment where, like we've said 20 times today, to, I guess, put a kind of apocalyptic spin on it, to create from the ashes, right? To create the phoenix. then that's exciting. We get to tell the next chapter, but also maybe also take a step back and see there is no rubble. There's an arc that's been in motion, if that makes sense.
That's the mythic perspective. I just want to say, just to tantalize for next week, but also I'm sorry to add another thing onto your thing, but what you're saying is that we are all becoming victims of the devil's cocktail, which is the stories that are being told in the media, the stories that are being told everywhere we look about what is happening and whose perspective. And
that's where I was headed, to be honest. We really got to wrap this up, but that's where I was headed. I just wanted to say, just a couple of days ago thought, now and then I'll propagate a news story, like the truth, the one video that's most indicative of what happened, in Minneapolis. And I even said, it's not like me, but I think it's important that we combat the false narrative with the truth. And I did propagate it. But for the most part, I feel like propagating the negativity, even if venting feels good, even if identity politics feels good, banding together, there is some value to it. But there is also this idea that you don't beat the drum of a grievance, you just create, right? That's how manifestation works. If you propagate a narrative, you're asking for more of the same. If you just focus on the goal and start telling that new story and create, that's actually the only way anything ever gets manifested. So that's what I want to end on. We just need to be creating. Maybe not lamenting, maybe not, grieving, maybe not putting energy on that. Put energy on the future.
Yeah,
absolutely. That. If you can imagine it, right? You can create it.
Right. That's where it begins. Okay, that's my platitude for the day.
Okay. Well, I think that was a beautiful place to end.
All right, then. Oh, thank you so much. This is so fun for me. Thank you so much. I feel blessed that you guys were willing to talk about my book. Thank you.
I'm more than willing to talk about your book. I wish that all the creatives out there would read it and use it as a little bit of a touch base manifesto for those dark times, right?
Well, it was just a conversation starter here. You brought so much to the table, so thank you.
Yes,
okay, and to our listeners, remember, we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can write a new story. See you next time. Don't go anywhere just yet. We have some highlights from the green room. As often happens, some good stuff comes up when we're just kind of shooting the breeze in the green room, and we thought we'd include it. Enjoy. We're going to be so fine, and this is going to be awesome. I'm not worried.
Yeah.
Is anyone worried?
No, I have no worries. I'm excited, actually. I'm excited. I have to just share one thing with you, Nick. I'm going through some interesting family stuff. I'm in the middle of a trial separation, Victoria, that my husband asked for after 33 years of marriage and 33 years of tumultuous, I hate you, I love you, I'm not like you anymore, marriage. So it's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing. And so I've just been in this really strange sort of in between what's next headspace, exhausted from the holidays. And I have to say, Nick, that going back and rereading this chapter pulled me completely out of that headspace and was like, that's right. This is why I'm here. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is what I'm supposed to be talking about. This is the whole sort of mythic approach, right? So it was divine timing in terms of the timing of my life to jump back into these thought forms. So I'm very grateful that there are no coincidences.
Right.
The synchronicity of this for me is a beautiful thing.
Oh my God. It means the world to me, by the way, to hear that, because I don't know that my writing has the power to do that, but it's wonderful to hear that it can, right? And that's the story of my life. One day you're putting out fires and you're very much in crisis mode, and it's not about the big picture, right? Or priorities or thinking about your calling or why you're here, but then when you get into that mind space, it's everything, purpose and contributing, and it becomes everything. And you're like, all that ego stuff it doesn't matter in the big picture, but it's we vacillate back and forth. So I think we're in alignment, because just this morning too, I was meditating, as I often do, just to, settle into this space.
Yeah.
And Michael Beckwith was playing in the background, and I just had this vision of, what is communion? Well, communion is each of us tapping into consciousness, or it's really just information, intelligence, right? Everything that's shuttling around our little molecules in our body, whatever that is, right? That you're tapping into it and communing with it. But then as much as I fucking hate church, when people come together, we're all vibrating and doing the same thing, and we're communing by channeling intelligence. So I just feel like what we do here, it can be silly and superficial, but it can also be quite profound, just because we're communing. Because we're furthering the conversation, and we're engaging in the dialectic. And isn't that everything?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the whole thing is that living in the tension of opposites between those kind of daily struggles, and then the entry back into a different level of consciousness in terms of thinking, and and of what it is that it means to live an embodied life, and how you balance those two things of being in that meditative communal space. It's like the idea of, like you talked about in the book, the drum circle, not only do mental and vibrations and brain vibrations come together, but hearts beat in synchronicity, and the body moves and beat to synchronicity, and it just the coming together of it all. And just, I don't know, it's like Joseph Campbell says, it's like to live in the idea of the higher consciousness and have the experience of being alive, right? To really be.
And isn't that so needed right now? I had that thought this morning too, that like, okay, a bunch of people can get together and commune, but if they're kind of the shared territory is cortisol and adrenaline and aggression, then you get a Hitler rally or a soccer, riot. So everybody thinks what they're doing, ideologically is a movement, and it's important. But what I came to is like, okay, but when you take all the spiritual traditions and the wisdom traditions and you put them all together, and I settled on Platonic values. Like it's pretty agreeable that what's going to get us out of this authoritarian kleptocracy mess is, yes, movements, individuals that are charismatic, that maybe form a movement, but it's the critical mass. I like that idea too. It's not the majority, it's a critical mass that can make a difference. So I feel like everybody thinks, Charlie Kirk's following. They probably felt they were communing and, I don't know, fueling what was needed. We all feel that way. But I settled on like Platonic values that are pretty inarguable in every wisdom tradition and every spiritual tradition. What do you think of that?
I mean, Jesus, we should be doing the podcast.
Well, I will be. I almost said that. I will be cutting some of this in. Do not worry.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, it's all about that idea of the tipping point, right? It's just that idea of that when consciousness comes together, and you have enough people moving the consciousness energy towards a transition point. Like one of the things that I find so interesting that I keep thinking about, that you write about in this chapter, in chapter 1, is the idea that humanity transforms best due to conflict resolution.
It's hard to remember that, isn't it? But that's what gets you through times like this. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then I thought, well, what about problem solving? And I thought, well, yeah, problem solving is good, but problem solving is like the microcosm of the actual conflict resolution, right? The problem for ancient Neolithic, newly agrarian man might have been, how do we grow enough grain, and how do we make sure that everyone is fed. And so you get your own village squared away, and then you get invaded by the next village that's starving, right? So once again, conflict resolution then basically trumps the idea of the problem solving. So I guess fascinating thought for me.
I don't know if this is related or if this explains my thinking in writing the book, but it was almost impossible to talk about the role of story without just generalizing about the creative process and, like you're saying, innovation, solving a problem. So I think, and then there's also the catharsis that results in a movement, but there's the shift in ideology too, thought forms, paradigms, policies that affect social reform. So I do kind of parse between, the noosphere we talk about,
Yeah.
the conceptual realm that's as important. It's as important that evolve as our biology. But I just found in the writing of the book and in all the other chapters too, by the way, this chapter 1's a sampler platter. But I always thought, oh, well, the same could be said of creativity in general, or creative efforts in general, or the creative process in general. It's all about new novel thought forms and innovative thought forms. And story is one aspect of that, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think about like, oh my God, look at everything that's going on. I just think about like right now, what's happening like in Iran, like that's not really being covered very much by the news because of what's going on here. And talk about something developing, out of the thought forms of wanting freedom and freedom from, from really restrictive Islamic culture and that then their story for so long is being under this oppressive realm and this oppressive rule, religious rule, conservative religious rule, and then now you have this conflict resolution. I mean, they're in the middle of the conflict. I mean, they're trying, they're actively, hopefully, writing the revolutionary chapter of their story and looking at, that's, I mean, I don't know. We just live it. We just live it every day, and people don't really think about it. People don't.
Well,
really
it's hard to take a step back and see the full arc, right? I mean, I was in 6th grade when the Shah was exiled and Khomeini took over, and it's all just one arc, in my opinion. And your beautiful essay that you shared on here about I always say it wrong, the warrior goddess. No, the
the
sage and the
right. The idea of the embodiment of within what I saw within Kamala Harris as the warrior and the sage. Yeah.
Right. I think we all saw it that way. Yeah. And I think what we talked about, I think what we agreed on is that patriarchy is on its way out. And so when you take a step back and you look at the progression, even the Arab Spring is part of this one arc we're talking about. But the idea of doing away with really oppressive, again, Platonic values, oppressive values, whether it's through Islam or whatever, take away your personal liberty, your equanimity, all those things that women are being robbed of. Yep. It's no different than our movement against patriarchy, exploitation,
Christian
colonization, right? All of that. Yeah. So it's one movement. And I think, it can become problematic when you look at it this way. But one school of thought is there's an overriding philosophy on the planet at any given time, regardless of Eastern, Western, you name it. And I think it's problematic, but I see it. When you look at our revolution and the French Revolution, they happened at a moment when Sophism was at the forefront, ideologically. And that was literally, again, about personal liberty, equanimity, and that was new. To think about one's personal liberty and freedom was a rather new concept. So I kind of see it happening all over, and that's exciting to me. And then tell me if you see this. There's always a backlash. Those those waspy, privileged white men are digging in their heels and digging up old, tired tropes because they're desperate. They sense and they feel that certain things are on their way out. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think though we may not live to see the new paradigm, we are like planting the seeds for those who follow us, and we're in these tumultuous times of change. And this is what happens, I think, is patriarchy is like a wild, cornered beast. and we are seeing the last swipes.
Right.
The last razor-clawed swipes.
And the manosphere, do you know that term? I don't think about this stuff much, but I'm like, when you put the JD Vances, when you put them all together, and the incels and the manosphere and all these podcasters, and they're talking about how tanning beds reduce your sperm count, like something is wrong. That's the cornered beast we're talking about, right? And then all this, as a gay man, I see it clear as day. Like, why not talk about how all humans can be their best selves? Why are we talking? It's like redefining masculinity. I kind of get it in a way, because in the same way women are asked to be all things to all people and have been for a long time, men are also, if they're too sensitive, they're pussies. So we're being asked to be a lot of things too. And so the conversation is logical, but I feel like let's not fantasize about this imagined lost masculinity that they're obsessing on. Why aren't we protectors and warriors anymore? Something's been taken from us. No, let's talk about what'll make all humans better. Am I making sense?
And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding or just non-awareness in some ways. If you look at this from an archetypal psychology point of view, and I know, Victoria, you may have some thoughts on this too, but is that understanding like what is masculine and what is feminine
has nothing to do with what's between your legs.
Yes, beyond the bounds of and limits of any particular culture, but looking at where do we have to go for both men and women in order to achieve, I guess, what we would call in alchemy the hieros gamos, or the sacred marriage, or the balance between the two, like the yin and the yang, so that life can be lived sustainably on the planet. Because if we can't figure that out, then we're headed down this really terrifying road of the next 100 to 200 years.
Yeah, I think sustainable is the key word. That's because we're not just talking about climate change and exploiting our resources, but just in every way, I think it's clear patriarchy has run its course, and everything that stems from it, like capitalist greed, and exploitation and slave labor, and exploitation of the planet itself. Like, it's pretty clear that it's run its course and was not sustainable for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Or longer,
it's
arguably.
It's we're in the midst of a great story. we are writing one chapter of the great story, and the question becomes, are we going to add to the chaos, or are we going to add to moving forward in some way that's going to lead towards honor and understanding and community and commiseration and working together and trying to create something new.
Maybe interconnectivity is part of that too, because
absolutely,
there's a lot of talk about how we live in a smaller world than ever, but yet we're more isolated than ever. I think it is a new growing pain that we have to think about nationalism versus globalism more than ever. And what does that look like? Anyway, the irony too is, in meditating this morning, I was like, we're not going to talk about the news. I'm sorry. It's too much. Like, I can't talk about Iran, and I'm not even up to speed on the latest. You tune out for one day and you miss all these crazy things that went down. So I just thought, we can't talk about the news. And here we are, because how can you not? This is the big story. This is the big story we're telling.
I know. You mean you can't drink water from a fire hose?
We want to take a moment to thank our wonderful listeners and supporters. Your continued support and sharing of our podcast helps us spread the transformative power of storytelling. If you enjoy our episodes, please rate and review us on your favorite platform and share the podcast with friends and family. For more enriching conversations and insights, subscribe to Language of the Soul podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media and visit our Patreon website for the latest updates and exclusive content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. If you'd like to support us further, consider joining our Patreon community for exclusive content and donation options. Every bit of support helps us reach more hearts and minds.